Chapter 161, Home Field Advantage. Chris. Point of view. It didn't take me long to run into the first of the wolves around our camp as I walked out. They kept a tight perimeter around us, and once I broke it, they made themselves known. I like to believe I had worked through everything since the change, but it was times like this that made me wonder if I hadn't. I wouldn't call it a thirst for bloodlust, but my desire for battle wasn't seen in the best light. Typically, people who threw themselves into unnatural danger didn't have everything sorted out up top. But that wasn't how I looked at it. It was something I liked doing, and it was something I would continue to do. It made me feel alive in a way nothing else did, and I enjoyed the excitement it gave off, even if it would be the death of me one day. The feeling of my hammer descending with mighty blow, or the ice swirling around me with my new wind law, it was almost euphoric. The blood was less pleasant, but I had long gotten used to the messy bits of fighting. It was hard not to with the amount of bodies I had waded through and the amount of destruction a blunt weapon swung at speed caused. Felt right to finally let go. To go all out in a way that felt refreshing. The wolves tried to group up, but numbers had always done little against me. If that weren't the case, I wouldn't have made it through the tutorial. I treated the pack like a 31st wave. Another one to fight through until one of us was left standing. I did feel bad about killing so many, but they would repopulate and grow back in no time. I didn't plan to hunt them all down if a few ran away, and there were surely more packs out there other than this one. Momentum of the avalanche began rolling behind me as I attacked the first wolf and started the onslaught. Glacial presence was already giving a small boost just because of how cold it already was without any of my other skills taking effect. Permafrost billowed out easier than ever before, taking to the ground quicker than even when I fought with the frost rune. Pushed out, freezing the earth and driving the temperature lower. My next skill was the upgraded hail. Desolate blizzard. It was the first time using it for a fight like this, and I couldn't wait to see how well it did. Hail had been mostly relegated to ice creation at the end of the tutorial, and it felt good to have another skill to use. Activating it felt much the same as permafrost. Almost like the environment wanted to be changed in the way I was asking it. Like the air and ground wanted to be that way, and it took my nudge with vigor instead of fighting against it. The winds built up and buffeted the bare trees around the wolves and picked up the snow on the ground. I channeled the skill more toward the winds and cold, laying off the ice generation. I had a different way to do that now. The skill sucked up mana at a dangerous pace, but the area around me came alive at its prodding. The first few wolves were already dead by this point, falling to my hammer while my other skills built up for the long haul. While the wolves were strong, my hammer was greater. The legendary skill was one of, if not my best. It was certainly my favorite. The whipping winds picked up the snow off the ground, and it turned into a legit blizzard as the flakes blew through the air. My ability to master the winds wasn't enough to direct them yet, so they tumbled this way and that, almost like it was a natural phenomenon. Just like I could control ice without ice manipulation, I could control the winds without the skill, but it was harder. I was just getting the hang of it with ice, and wind was far behind where I wanted it to be. My affinity helped, but that only gave me the barest hints of control rather than absolute control I wanted. The wind would always play second fiddle to my main element, ice, but it was unbecoming to leave my control in such a sorry state. Thinking that made me sound pretentious, but if I was going to use it in a fight, I needed it to be controlled and calculated. It wasn't worth it if I could do neither of those things. More wolves came in response to the scene I was causing, and it made me feel nostalgic. Having a mass of enemies come to me while I stood and fought. It wasn't the one-off fight that only took a few swings and barely got me in the spirit. It wasn't the low-level beasts quickly crushed. It was challenging enough I felt the need to use frost armor, and the familiar layer of ice froze over my form. It was nice to be back in fighting shape again, to actually need to push things again, rather than forcing myself to hold back. The wolves were mostly above level 60, with some nearly 70 and above. Over 10 levels above where I was, but that was what it took for me to feel a challenge. If the pack were any smaller, I would have left it to the others. But it wasn't, and I got to feel my heart beating again. The fight was only beginning, but it felt good to release a bit of pressure inside, so I went with it and pushed harder. To see how far I could take it. My bloodline hadn't changed since the tutorial and it was still the same as the last time I used it, but it felt more. Cold spread throughout my body as my strength increased and my form grew ever slightly. My hammer whistled through the air a touch faster and the nip of my skills increased even further. This was the first time I was calling on my bloodline in a truly Arctic environment. Every time before it was in an artificially curated one and somehow I could feel the difference. It was like the mana meant more compared to being the result of a mana stone and rune. Like it held more weight even though the mana density was at a level I was familiar with and fought in before. Feeling this increase even though nothing notable had changed, I pushed against it as hard as I could. If the area was so keen on taking to what I was asking it to, I wanted to see how far I could push it. Light blue mana rushed through me as I pushed my law and mana into my skills harder, pushing against the confines of where they usually stopped. The trees started to groan from what I was doing. Creaks and pops fired off from the ones nearby from the water inside them freezing and expanding quickly. After that, while swinging at any of the wolves that came close, I ventured out into a new way to use a skill. It wasn't only permafrost and desolate blizzard that I pushed against. Sweeping snow created its own snow to work with, but I already had some readily available swirling around me. It would be a waste not to use what Mother Nature so helpfully provided. The skill pushed out past the ends of my hammer, where it usually stopped, and the mana carried outward into the flakes in the air. For the first time, the skill extended past the extent of my body and hammer, activating on something I wasn't directly holding. I couldn't spend my attention on it now, but I would be testing that later. The snow came alight as the mana enhanced the flakes, making them sharper and harder. They blew around a touch faster and were a lot easier to control, but I left them to blow erratically like before. There was a certain beauty in the chaos. Drops of blood started falling before the winds picked those up too. The red drops of liquid quickly froze into pinkish snowflakes and joined with their not-so-white anymore counterparts. The group sliced through the fur of the wolves, causing more blood and fur to get picked up by the wind and coating the area in red as they revolved around me. While calling on my bloodline boosted all of my skills, I refrained from using righteous fury. I was feeling the current of the fight pull on me to do more, but I wasn't willing to deal with the backlash of the skill or the timer it forced me to fight on. Secondly, I wanted to hold a few things back just in case. I also didn't use my anchor, only pulling on my law to strengthen my ice and make the cold even greater. The wolves tried and failed to attack me and I pushed on to where I felt the strongest was. It was nice to get back into feeling like this, like I could take on the world and come out alive. Elliot. Point of view. After watching the man wade into the dark forest, he sat there silently wondering what to do. He and Samuel were both speechless and at a loss. If it were anyone else, he would say they were mad. Going to fight the entire pack alone was insane, but this was the leader they were supposed to be following. While he didn't care much about who led the caravan, he did still feel indebted a touch for the opportunity. He wanted to help if there was a chance for him to do good, but doing so now was suicide. He wouldn't even be able to take on 2 of the wolves, let alone the entire pack. Even if his whole town went out together, they would fail to defeat them. But he was just one person and he walked so confidently out into the forest. He wasn't crazy, was he? With only a few interactions with the man, Elliot wasn't accustomed to him that well, but he didn't come off as insane. He only came off a bit gruff and steadfast. Not throw yourself to the literal wolves bats hit insane. Still, he had to huddle up to the fire a bit closer because a bone-chilling wind blew in from the forest. It put goosebumps up and down his body and it felt like the furs he was wearing did nothing to break the wind chill. Being in the cold as long as they had and being from Canada to begin with, Elliot had gotten good at dealing with the chill, but this was different. Even with all the layers he had on and the outer coat of thick fur to blunt the wind, it didn't help. Even the heat from the once roaring fire couldn't be felt as the cold overtook his body. The fire even sputtered slightly from the wind, threatening to wink out until Samuel put another log on it, feeding it more. Growls, yelps, and barks sounded out not that long after the chill blew through and people everywhere in the camp became alert at the sound of wolves. Some jumped to their weapons and armor, getting ready for the attack they knew was coming, while others arose from slumber already dressed for battle. Just as people were about to rush off to their posts, a flash of light caught everyone's attention. The light easily pierced through the dark night, and everyone turned to its origin. At the source, they found one of the leaders of the caravan standing on a cart with his spear glowing slightly at the tip and waiting to speak. The people gearing up turned to him for direction, and he waited until it quieted down. "Settle down, everyone. There's no need for panic." The words did little against the barks and yelps sounding out in the forest. Everyone knew the wolves would come, and it sounded like they were attacking something already. People's eyes shifted out to where the noise was coming from before focusing back on the man with the spear. "Everything is under control. Try to get some rest while the wolves get cleaned up." Confusion spread about what was going on, but Elliot knew. He knew who was out there battling the wolves, but everyone else was unaware. "What's going on? Why are there sounds of battle?" Questions sounded out from the crowd, and from beside him Samuel shouted out one of his own. "Does he need help?" Hearing someone was out there fighting, it didn't take people long to put two and two together. Christopher was the one who usually led, but another man was standing in his place instead. It wasn't a far leap to realize who was out there. "No, he does not need any help." It was almost said with an audible sigh. "Try to get some rest before we continue traveling in the morning." Everyone was a bit stunned, and nobody knew what to do. They were told to try and get some rest, but there was no way they were doing that now. Especially with some of the sounds they were hearing from out in the forest, let alone the ground shaking at irregular intervals. Chapter 162 New Skill. Chris. Point of view. I pushed my law to go further, both in the strength of my ice and the cold it produced. Some of the constant growth I had felt from the tutorial was missing, and I wanted to make up for that. It was obvious that I wouldn't grow as fast now that we were out of the tutorial, but it still felt weird to be the same level for weeks on end. Even though each level took longer and I didn't have ample opportunity to get essence, it still felt like I wasn't doing anything. At this point, the tutorial had been over for longer than we were in it. I knew that would be the case. I knew that it would pick up again when we finally settled down and I could run dungeons on a regular basis, but it was still disappointing. The wolves tried to stop me from approaching the pack leader, but they weren't able to hold up. It wasn't even necessary to wait for Avalanche to build. The bodies accumulated as I carved my way toward the leader, and I finally laid eyes on him after almost half an hour of fighting. It dwarfed the other wolves by a head and a half in both bulk and height. Plus, it had a different feel to it, like it was above the rest. It watched me approach with a deep snarl in its throat and rage in its eyes, well beyond the emotions the wave monsters would show. It did not like what I was doing to its pack, and it spent no time sizing me up before charging toward me. Pushed its pack mates out of the way and charged directly at me. I pushed on Sweeping Snow and dumped more of my mana into it, trying to speed up the rate at which I killed the lesser pack. Something about the leader told me to finish the ones around me quickly so more of my attention would be free to deal with it. It had a feeling about it that reminded me of the bosses from the waves. A quality to it that signaled a wellspring of power. Keeping track of its charge was difficult with all of the bodies around me, but I managed to do so just in time to brace myself for its attack. The wolf came in with jaws wide and teeth glistening with mana, ready to chomp down on me. It took every bit of my reaction time to snap my hammer around to defend against it, knocking its head out of the way with my swing. If it was the average monster, almost every monster, it would have died to that kind of swing with their head caved in, but the leader brushed it off without a scratch. After my hit knocked the wolf, of course, it charged past me with its excess momentum. His body was fine, and it only needed to right itself in the correct direction and charge again. It didn't show any sign of injury or of being hurt from what I did. As it recovered, I pushed Sweeping Snow to cut it, to rip and tear at the leader while it was staggered, but nothing happened. The snowflakes bounced off its fur like they were rubber balls rather than the sharp blades they were. After cutting it failed, I pushed on the cold to penetrate into the beast, but that too failed. My snow was too weak to cut it, and the cold couldn't penetrate past its fur. Where the pack members were cut and pulverized, the leader brushed it off like it was nothing. It gave me hope of a challenge. Mana mixed with something else formed back onto the wolf's snout, and it came in for another attack. A law of some kind was mixed into its skills, but I wasn't sure what type it was. It wasn't elemental, as I was familiar with those by now, and it intrigued me. The power coming off of it was similar in strength to my own law. It was a lesser law. The first beast I had seen with an upgraded law. By this point all the other wolves had either died or backed off to give us room to duke it out, creating a circle around us to fight in, and the leader wasted no time restarting the bout. The weight and speed it charged with forced me to brace myself against the ground lest I be pushed back. Similar to the vine bears so long ago, it tried to use its size and mass against me. Where that once surprised me, it failed to do so this time. The ground was covered in snow, and standing atop it made my footing more secure than ever. It was a paltry effort of will to freeze the ice covering my boots to what was blanketing the earth. The connection webbed out, giving me the secured base to take any charge. It was with the same flex of will that let me pick up my foot again without being stuck to the ground. There was a fine line between bracing myself by securing my feet to the ground and rooting myself in place detrimentally, and I had trained to keep that from happening. No matter how hard the wolf charged or pushed, I wouldn't be moved. It bit chunks out of my armor, and I returned with heavy blows rained down upon it. For every bite landed, I smashed one of my own. Hit for hit. It nearly caused me to smile when I saw blood leaking down my armor. Streaks of red originating from the rents of ice missing and teeth marks. The wolf wasn't much better. Blood leaked out of its mouth and one of its front legs was smashed beyond recognition. But it still held a stout growling in its throat. It wasn't giving up, and neither was I. The resilience it showed caused me to pull harder, dig deeper, dragging out every scrap of strength my stats gave me and then some. Fighting the lesser wolves took more controlled hammer swings to make me as efficient as possible. The leader took a different approach. Fighting something strong like the pack leader took swings of all the strength I could put behind it. There were times I missed, and great chunks of earth exploded in my face as my hammer hit the ground instead of my target, but those were necessary to land a hit of any significant effectiveness. Mighty blow and pervading cold lit up my hammer while similar skills flowed out of the wolf to match. The lesser ones circled around, only attacking when they sensed an opportunity, flying in to bite at my feet of lower legs while I was focused on my swings. At the rate it was going, we were both landing hits, and I wasn't sure who would last longer without something changing. The state we were in reminded me of how I formed my anchor in the first place. A brutal fight which took everything in me to power one more swing. The incessant urge to take just one more down. It made me smile to have that feeling come back, and I unleashed it inside of me. My anchor was what kept me going through longer fights and from flagging during intense ones like this. I couldn't hold it back any longer, nor did I want to. Frozen Patchwork was already struggling to keep up with some of the more serious wounds it had managed to get on me. I managed to land a few good hits on it to match, but it had an entire pack to help it. I did not. My anchor flowed into me and did what it could to right what was broken. It held no healing properties, but it made it easier to work through what was wrong. Like dulling the pain of walking with broken ribs rather than setting them back into place. A resiliency to push through rather than fixing what was wrong. It strengthened my form and pushed reinforced body past where the lesser wolves could injure, making their attacks only annoying rather than harmful. The leader nipped and chomped at me the best it could, but we were both evenly matched. Its size and bulk weren't enough to overpower my strength, and mine wasn't enough to get through its fortitude. Even with mighty blow and pervading cold to layer on my hammer, it wasn't enough to leave lasting damage. A mana type I wasn't familiar with purged any ice mana in its system with ruthless efficiency. Like it was offended at the thought of being impure. Whatever mana type it was strong enough to eliminate the cold I was trying to press into it. The wolf started glowing in a luminescence similar to Austin but not as bright. A stunning silver radiated out, but that wasn't what I focused on. What I focused on was the glowing effect spread to all the wolves surrounding us as well, and the beacon of light extending unnaturally high in the sky. It was trivial to sense it getting stronger, so I pulled on Righteous Fury to match it. If it was pulling on its pack for strength, I would pull on my rage. Even after all this time, there was enough rage still in me to go around. We clashed again and again to the same effect. Both pulling on everything but neither able to finish the other. If it were alone and not supported by the numerous wolves surrounding us, it would have died then. Righteous Fury provided a good enough boost I would have been able to overpower it, but with a boost of its own we remained matched. It was now that I had two paths from here. The fight could take one of two turns, and I had to choose which I preferred. I could start chipping away at the wolves surrounding us, eliminated the source of its strength. Or push through and kill the boss regardless of how many wolves it wanted to pull strength from. I knew which I preferred, and the wolf made a move to facilitate doing that exact thing. The wolf growled menacingly at not being able to defeat me and jumped back, creating space between us. I wasn't sure what it was doing, but I wasn't about to let it have time to attack freely, and it gave me ample chance to prepare my finisher. One final attack to end things and see who was left standing. It was fitting in a primal way I enjoyed immensely. I knew any attempt to interrupt what it was doing would be met by the wolves surrounding us throwing themselves at me. They had changed their formation to protect the leader, and it was obvious what it was planning. It would use its pack to delay and buy time for whatever attack it was trying to power. With only one option before me, I charged straight toward the leader. The lesser wolves were relentless in their assault to stop me, but Avalanche was near full and my stats were nearing their peak. The fight had gone on for longer than anticipated, and the bursting strength inside me, I would not be denied. Just when I pushed past the last one separating me from the stationary leader, I felt its power get a boost. Cocked its head back and howled at a moon I didn't even know was there. Clouds parted the sky, revealing a glistening beam of moonlight streaming down, spotlighting the wolf in front of me. The wolf was a lunar wolf. It made sense now, the purging of my ice from its system and the unfamiliar law I felt. I hadn't seen anyone with lunar powers yet, and this was a first. It was similar to what Austin could do with the sun, except it could call upon the moon. I hadn't expected to need a full avalanche to deal with some wolves up here, but I was glad I had it now. I could feel the skill the pack leader was powering, and it was making my hairs stand on end. Nothing else we had come across needed this kind of force to put down. Instead of worrying me about the area we were choosing to settle in, it gladdened me to know there were still challenges out there. It put a smile on my face to be pushed this far, to be required to pull out my newest edition that I only just recently received. I tried not to use it because it wasted the materials of whatever I killed, but it was warranted this time. Without it, I wasn't sure I would win. The skill I received for reaching level 60 and the second my legendary class had offered. The skill itself wasn't legendary, but it felt powerful enough to be one to me. The few times I had used it were enough to understand the power it held, even if the backlash it caused would take a while to recover from. Forcing mana into the skill for only the 5th time, I felt it flow into my hammer. The rush of energy from the skill was a marvel to see even if I had done this before. I didn't think I would ever get over how it felt. If I still wielded my old hammer, it would have shattered to pieces at this point. I was grateful the class gave me my hammer first, before I picked up my new skill. Even still, as the skill flowed into the hammer, cracks and rifts began to form and groan along its length. The wood creaked and the ice frozen to it splintered and cracked. It sounded like standing upon a frozen lake that was just thick enough to hold your weight but not enough to bear it without struggle. Not sharp pops that made you scared of breaking through, but low groans that made you cautious of what you were doing and proceed carefully. The carved lines running the shaft of the weapon slightly glowed, but only the barest portion of the runes did so. Most remained dark and void of power, but a single string of runes running the length pulsed as the skill ran through it. It flowed up the wooden shaft along the string of runes, and once it reached the head of the weapon, it began to alter its shape. The flat hammer head began to crack and shatter, but held together enough to show it was designed to do that, rather than buckling under the skill's strength. It was like the hammer and skill were made to go together, and it was taking on a different appearance to match. If the hammer was once one pristine block of ice, it was now a cobbled mess of chunks. But even as the hammer broke apart, it didn't appear weakened. It still held the power it once did, only in a different form. As the last pops and groans of shifting ice sounded out, and the skill was ready, I brought my hammer down with every ounce of strength I could muster. The wolf must have sensed something different with this blow, but it couldn't get out of the way quick enough to escape its path. As the hammer descended, I chanted the name of the skill in my head. Shattering Hammer. Chapter 163. March on. As the face of my hammer connected with the wolf, The cracks on the hammer's face spread out from the impact site following unseen lines in a pattern only known to it. In the milliseconds since impact, the wolf showed visible effects of what was done to it. Its body shuddered and swayed as it was torn asunder as it tried and failed to wail, its throat incapable of even that. The appearance of the cracks faded from my hammer as the energies left the hammer and transferred into the body of the wolf, showing themselves along its skin as they spread outward. The transfer wasn't entirely perfect and some of it diverted down into the ground, but most was on target enough to land where I was aiming. Where I had missed and the skill got diverted into the ground showed the effects more noticeably than on the wolf. Great rents were carved upon the frozen earth and thick and thin gouges radiated outward from the impact site, turning the once even and pristine ground into separated chunks all at different heights. Even permafrost hardening the ground and freezing it solid, it failed to hold up against the might of my new skill. What showed upon the ground was also happening inside the wolf's body, and it wasn't long before the wolf, once glowing and mighty, staggered and fell on its side. Blood pooled along the various rents in its form and leaked out of various cuts upon its form. I looked on, briefly swaying from the strain, while the wolf lay prone, hacking and wheezing as blood filled its lungs, trying to excavate the liquid out only for more to fill them back up. It was dead even if it didn't know it. This was the reason I didn't like to use the skill very often. It introduced a delayed death that only caused pain and suffering. It was not very pleasant to watch, and I could only imagine how the wolf felt as it lay there struggling as its body ripped apart from the swirling energies inside it. Observing the skill work its way through my foes was unpleasant. While we were fighting to the death, it was a level of cruelty I didn't enjoy basking in. Anything of lesser strength would have exploded in a shower of gore from the energies tearing it apart, which was why using it on the weak was a waste. Doing so only created a mess and strained me unnecessarily. It went to show the wolf's strength, being able to last this long, fighting with everything it had to stand back up. Its claws reached out, raking the snow and dirt, attempting to get its feet under it many times only for it to fall back down in failure. The rest of the pack could only look on in fear as they watched their leader scramble and fail to stand. There was a vitality working inside of it trying to stitch its body back together, but it wouldn't be enough. The silver glow from the moon continually dimmed and its fight to stand slowed. The vigor it showed in trying to fight on was honorable, and it didn't feel good to watch on as it suffered. Righting myself after the backlash washed over me, I stood to give it a good end. It tried to flinch away at my approach, but it wasn't able to get very far, falling down not 2 steps away from where it started. There was a fear in its eyes that replaced the rage it once held there. Fear of death. It knew it was going to die, yet it fought on anyway. I stood next to it with my hammer in the ground and gave it as honorable a send-off as I could. You fought well and you should be honored. I wish you well on your journeys to come. Raising my hammer above my head one final time, its descent caused the wolf to still and brought its motion to an end. After bringing my hammer down to end it, my body fell to a knee as my legs failed me. The other wolves took this as their chance to escape, and they all booked it as fast as possible away from where I knelt. Shattering Hammer was the skill I had picked up after reaching level 60, and from my initial tests of it, it was a fantastic skill. The 3 options I was offered at the time all had their perks, but this was the one I felt fit me best for right now. One was a more defensive option which I felt I had covered, and the other branched out in a different direction I didn't wish to take right away, leaving Shattering Hammer the best choice. It fixed one of my biggest weaknesses right now, but the skill did come at a cost. The weakness it fixed was if I found something I could not cut or pierce with ice, while also being tough enough that my hammer blows were ineffectual. Mighty Blow and Pervading Cold could be added to my swings to make them more powerful, but other than that, I was out of options for what to do. If I still couldn't kill something when Avalanche peaked and Righteous Fury was active, I was shit out of luck. The first time I ran into the problem was when I was fighting the metal ants of the tutorial. Their hard metal exoskeletons made most of my ice skills ineffective, and they could brush off my swings with little more than a dent. I took heavy wounds fighting them just because of how long it took me to kill one of them. They were able to hold up longer than anything else in the tutorial, and the waves of them were too much for me to handle effectively. I still won, but at a great cost of effort and mana while also receiving devastating wounds. I doubted I would run into many foes that had that combination of protections, but I wished to have something more to use. A strong finisher or something I could pull out when my max just wasn't good enough. The skill took a lot out of me and I couldn't use it a lot, but it worked to fill that role spectacularly. The reason I couldn't use it frivolously other than being unnecessary was because of the cost it took to activate. The mana cost was high, but that was to be expected from such a skill. It was the physical toll on my body that hindered its use. Where Mighty Blow took stamina and my law caused mental strain, Shattering Hammer wore on my body worse than anything else. After using it, my body felt like going 10 rounds with the Vine Bear from the tutorial hitting me all at once. The skill was only epic, but I doubted my body or hammer could handle it if it was legendary. As my stats grew and my body refinement level improved, I would be able to use the skill more frequently, but for now, once or twice in a short period was all I could muster. A second use wasn't going to be required this time. Looking over the corpse made me grit my teeth. My Vine Bear pelt was coming to an end for its usefulness, and the wolf's pelt would have made a great replacement, but there wasn't much of it that was left intact. The fangs and claws made it out mostly unscathed, but the meat and hide were all but ruined. The rest of the wolves could fill the need for food, but I wanted the leader's pelt, and it was unfortunate I couldn't have it. Sam might be able to do something with it, but I doubted it. Unless her skills got much better in a short time to be able to stitch the damage I caused back together. Another detriment of using Shattering Hammer. The rest of the wolves had long made a run for it, and I wasn't going to chase them. They wouldn't bother us anymore, and it was unnecessary to hunt them down to the last. Plus, it would wreck the local wildlife if I killed all the predators. Mana did miraculous things, but it wouldn't bring the wolf population back from extinction. Extinction was a finality even mana couldn't fix. They would recover, and they would do it faster than ever before as well. I wasn't sure of the specifics, but either they had more per litter or less were lost during their births, so repopulation wouldn't be an issue. It wouldn't be the same mating rate as when the planet was being terraformed, but they would be back to carrying capacity in no time even with the amount I had killed. It was honestly kind of scary to know how fast they could reproduce. That was only for the normal wolves though. The leader took a special kind of grit, and it would be a while until another could take its place. Their levels would also take longer to recover. They hadn't started out this strong, and it would take a while for them to gain it back. The pack would likely splinter under various leaders without the steady strength that had held it together. That wasn't as important though. It would only really matter if we ended up staying here, and that was yet to be known. We had only just gotten to our marker, and we would explore the place tomorrow to scout it out. It took a while for my body to recover and for me to get well enough to stand, but I eventually did. Cleaning up the best I could, I trudged back into camp using my hammer as a crutch. Hal and others were in charge of dismantling the bodies for anything useful, and the only thing I would do was get in the way. What met me when I returned was an audience larger than I remembered being up when I left, but I thought nothing of it. I was too tired from the fight and hurting from using Shattering Hammer to care too much. No one said a word as I limped by, which made my walk slightly uncomfortable, but I wasn't about to break the silence. It wasn't until I got back to my tent that someone spoke, and it was broken. Austin was leaning up against my tent waiting upon my arrival, and he looked me up and down slowly. His spear was planted in the ground at his feet, and he used it to prop himself up. He seemed to be relaxed despite the worried faces I passed before and the tense atmosphere elsewhere in the camp. "Was that really necessary?" Austin asked, and before I could say a word he continued. "You gave everyone a scare when you went out there alone. I even had to calm some of them down from doing something stupid like entering the fight." I knew he wasn't really upset, but he was peeved he had to step in. He didn't much like taking charge, and I was sure he didn't appreciate having to do so. "It will make our job easier for tomorrow." Exhaustion forced me to take a breath before finishing. They would have played games, and people would have been on edge. This fixed both problems. Another deep breath sucked air in before I bent into my tent with Austin following behind me. My eyes roved left and right, but didn't find another waiting to ambush me. My tent being empty was good, but all that meant was she would have words with me tomorrow. Well, something to look forward to. The ice covered my armor from most of the blood and gore, but some of it made it through, either seeping through cracks or from when chunks were torn out during the battle. Austin was silent as I slogged the armor off and gave it a cursory wipe down with a rag before doing the same to my body. Blood had stopped leaking out of my wounds once the fight ended, and they were now sealed in ice and would remain so throughout the night. With the temperatures slated to get dangerously low, cold meditation would have me bandaged up before the sun rose. I would do a more detailed cleaning of my armor in the morning. I was too tired to do it now. Austin watched on in silence as he waited for me to finish before speaking up again. "And what if this isn't the place?" "Then we march on," I said simply. It wasn't a doubt what we would do. "We continue north?" I know we laid out the different markers at the start, but that was before living through it. The weather will only get worse, and we already have to huddle for warmth and struggle out in the open. How much further are you willing to push on if it doesn't fit what you're looking for? "Until we find it." He stayed quiet for a beat. "Not everyone is so inclined to the cold. If it gets much worse, some may actually die from exposure. Not everyone has your fortitude." He didn't give me a chance to respond before using his spear to open the tent flap and walk out. I felt we were close. So close to finding the spot we would build upon. Close to finding home. Night faded to the sun, and the first rays of sunlight signaled the start of yet another day. My body protested against my movement, but it was nothing like the pain last night. Spending the night in meditation had me good enough to go about my day if a bit sore. As people rose with the sun, the camp brushed off the frost built up over the night and exited their warm tents to a devastating cold. The start was slow, but people were used to such days and went on their way. Scouts roamed out surveying the area, and I took a slow look around myself. The area around the two dungeons was large, and multiple eyes would make finding spots easier. Everyone was informed what to look for and to report back if they found anything interesting. Spots easily defensible or hard to attack were the priority, but high-grade materials wouldn't be left behind. Cliffs with only one side needing to be defended or tall hills that were hard to scale quickly. The terrain was our friend, and one less direction to defend would make things all the more easy. It also needed to be close to water and fertile land to grow food. While defensible was the most important, it couldn't be too far for what it took to survive. A city without food and water wouldn't last long. Try as everyone did, the place couldn't support the vision I had. There were no cliffs or hills, nor mountains or valleys. It was generally flat with only a few rises in the area, little more than a small hill to build upon. A river flowed into the lake, but that wouldn't help much with flat plains on either side. It wasn't the spot, and it didn't feel like the place we were meant to settle. People moaned about it, but we moved on. The weather continually worsened, and Austin's prediction only got closer to the truth. It got so cold we needed to add more breaks to light fires and stop during certain times because the wind was too bad. There were a few days when a heavy snowstorm stopped travel completely until it let up and we could move again. I was back in tip-top shape after a day in the cold, and I sat in the lead, paving the way forward, clearing the ground for the wagons behind to follow. It wasn't even winter yet, and things were already this bad. The next marker also wasn't what we were looking for, and we had to push on as well. I didn't lose hope, though. I knew we were close. I could feel it. Chapter 164, Extended Stay. Abigail. Point of view. She tried her best to keep the caravan going, but the ever-worsening conditions made things hard. They were running out of thick furs for clothes and blankets. Firewood was running low, which would force them to stop and chop more soon, and people were getting sick from staying out too long. Connor was behind on making medicine, and that was only the beginning of their troubles. Everyone was on the brink of exhaustion because of the pace Chris set, but no one was willing to speak up about it. After the fight with the wolves, everyone not of their family refused to say anything that would hinder their path forward. It would have to be her talking some sense into him, as everyone else was too scared. Chris didn't know it, but him demolishing the pack made nearly everyone fear him to some degree. No one else in the group could have gone out alone and done what he did, and his image had changed after people knew of his accomplishment. He didn't even have to say anything or tell the tale. Just the state of the bodies and the destruction of the area where the fighting occurred were enough to paint the picture. The people in charge of dismantling the bodies knew how high level all of them were, and they knew how powerful the leader was. The remnants of its mana and law were still suffused in its pelt, and the person in charge of skinning had to replace his knife afterward as it was irreparably misshapen. People talked in hushed whispers as the rumors spread, and even if Abigail wanted to, she doubted she could have stopped them. She wouldn't have, as this cemented Chris in a better light as a powerful leader, but it was out of the bag now and there was no taking it back. After finding the first possible spots not to his liking, he pushed forward faster every time. Like he was rushing to get where he wanted, and each disappointment only made him more agitated. They had long left what any normal person would consider harsh winter and had stepped into something else entirely. The snowfall was so thick, a wall of white met their eye in every direction that was impossible to see through. On the days that didn't have any snow, the glistening reflection of the sun made everything so bright you needed sunglasses to see anything. If it wasn't one thing, it was another. Austin had a great time during those days, but everyone else was miserable. Some even got sunburned from the intense reflections. Sunburn. In the winter. It wasn't new or unheard of for her, but never in this intensity or quantity. She knew this couldn't continue, and if after this next stop they still didn't find it, she would have to say something. They were beyond where they should have stopped to begin with. She and the others had tried to get him to settle for one of the previous markers, but Chris refused, saying it just wasn't right. Trying to get him to see reason only did the opposite. When she spoke of the ever-decreasing temperatures and how people couldn't handle it, Chris had the fire mages spread out through the line to be portable heaters. When she spoke of the snow being too much to travel through, he sat at the front and plowed his way through with ice manipulation. When the winds blew so hard and sharp bits of ice nipped at people, he condensed the caravan and stood in the center, diverting it away as best he could. He did that throughout the blizzard for 5 hours straight until the winds died down and they made it through the other side. It was asinine, but no matter how much Abigail tried, Chris refused to give up on their search. All she could do was hope this next marker was the one. Chris, point of view. I could feel it, this was going to be the one. My mind pointedly ignored the fact that I had felt that way about the 2 previous spots, but I meant it this time. I had almost caved and settled at the last one, but I held strong. I wasn't looking for a spot to build the average city. I wanted a spot to build the perfect city. It was outlandish to think I would actually find the perfect spot, but I at least wanted one better than average. All the previous ones weren't what I was looking for, but I believed this one would be different. The lake our first marker sat on was quite large, and there were a few more places we stopped along its shores, but we moved on from all of them. They had ample water and places to grow food, but it wasn't very defensible. The northern shores were the marker we were coming from, and we were moving on to the next in line. There were only a few placed out further north, and even though Abigail would say otherwise, I knew we couldn't keep going. We would have to stop soon, even if I didn't find it. The land here was filled with water and the ground seemed fertile enough. The only thing we were missing was a defensible spot. The area was dotted with various ponds and lakes, depending on your definition, and they were littered around the area ample enough for a water supply and irrigation. It put Minnesota's land of 1,000 lakes to shame. Water manna during the summer would be aplenty after they thawed out, but right now, the ice manna they produced now only added to what was already there. The sheer density of the stuff was like nothing I had ever felt. The cold was more refreshing than any stimulant, and it only got more pure and dense as we continued north. This place was welcoming in a way I hadn't known was possible, and it was hard not to push for more, to keep going without regard for stopping just to wade deeper in. I couldn't though, and I knew that if I went any further people might actually die. It felt that way now, and it would through the winter months, but the manna would change with the seasons and ice wouldn't dominate year-round. We had marked where the ice stayed frozen year-round on the map before we started, and we were still a distance away from that line. Water would have its time, especially with all the lakes, and food would still be growable, if a bit sparse. An unexpected boon during the clear sunny days was the light manna that gathered atop the snow. The reflection on the white plain was enough to create a decent amount of it in one place, and Austin would have his affinity present as well. Another harsh wind picked up, and I did my best to blunt it and cold from the center of the caravan, but it wasn't enough. Some still got through even when I tried my best, and I could see people shivering as it blew past them. Concentrating as much as possible, I pulled deeper on my affinity and laws when a sudden stop of movement sent me tumbling forward and off the top of my wagon. Without seatbelts, it was impossible to secure myself. What in the hell? I grumbled as I picked myself out of the snow with only mild irritation, questioning why we had stopped, and suddenly at that, I was too far away from the head of the caravan to see anything, so I started making my way to the front. Along the way, I spotted Abigail doing the same with a confused face to match my own. "Do you know why we stopped?" I asked. She shook her head no in response, and we both walked past people together. Before we made it there, Austin came jogging up to us with a smug expression and walked alongside us without saying anything. "Well, what is it?" I asked after he refused to explain. "Oh, and spoil the surprise. Where's the fun in that?" he said with a smile. While aggravating, I didn't push further. We were almost there anyway, and seeing it for myself would be faster than waiting for him to answer. The people we passed kept their voices low. It was clear they were curious as well, and they would all turn to watch us go by. It was a bit odd to feel their new gaze, but I was dealing with it. Their looks had changed recently, and I was pretty sure I knew why. Jonathan manned the first cart after I had given it up, and I saw him in the distance speaking animatedly with Hal for some reason. Both Hal and Austin being back was concerning, as at least one of the two was normally scouting ahead of us. It used to be both of them out together, but they needed to start taking breaks when the weather turned and traded off who was out in the cold. Both of them being back signaled a problem. I had to suppress a groan at that thought. I just wanted to settle down and place the pylon at this rate. Why did problems keep having to pop up? It didn't take a second after the thought arose that we found out the reason we weren't moving. The glaringly obvious reason we had stopped moving so abruptly. The ground fell away. While we weren't on a road, the path we were on was no longer viable after the ground disappeared in front of us. While cliffs and sharp inclines weren't common, we had seen enough to divert around them. Seeing one here shouldn't have been that big of an issue. Turning the carts to go around was a simple enough solution that a mass stop was unnecessary. We were close enough now not to shout, so I voiced my confusion. "Jonathan, why did we stop?" He just looked at me like the question was obvious and just pointed ahead, basically saying, "You'll see," without the words. And see I did. After reaching the front, the trees stopped blocking our vision and a giant cliff was revealed on either side. As far as I could see on both sides, the cliff dominated the terrain. The angle of the drop varied, but it never came close to anything climbable. It was a sheer drop by what I could see and nearly 90 degrees in most spots. I remained speechless surveying the terrain, and I couldn't help stepping up to the edge to see how far the drop was. This was the largest cliff we had come across, and it made me wonder why we hadn't seen it on the map. Something this large should have shown up. What met my vision as I peered over was a distance that scared me. The fall was far enough to make even me fear it. Enough that I had to gingerly step away slowly to not allow any chance of slipping. Falling was still a very real threat, and even with my high defense, I wasn't sure I would survive. Gravity didn't care how high my stats were, and a fall from this height was most likely fatal. Or, as my father would say, it's not the fall that kills you. It's the sudden stop at the end. It was a sudden stop I didn't feel like testing my mettle against for fear I would lose. As I looked over the giant rent along the land, I couldn't help but feel like this was it. It wasn't the perfect place I was looking for, but that feeling inside me was resonating with this place. While it wasn't perfect, we could make it so. I felt it once I laid eyes on the cliff. Looking out over what lay below only solidified the feeling. A sea of white that my mind turned into fields of crops when summer came. My fantasies went further, imagining a giant walled city butted up to the cliff edge. We would have to go up and down the cliff on both sides to find the best place, but it was a promising spot just from what I had seen already. As we grew in strength and rose through the ranks, the threat of the cliff being climbed would turn more viable, but enchantments could fix that. Same with anyone who tried to blow the ground from under the city to cause a collapse. Any kind of durability runes and formations lining the cliff would be enough to stop that. I already knew a few things that would work to stop those two things from happening. My vision continued picking apart different details, but it was coming together into a picture I quite enjoyed. The cliff would force people to attack from only one side, directly eliminating the need to defend half the city. If we found a place that jutted out farther, that could be cut down even further. Like a peninsula without the water. Even with only half the city being assailable, That was much better than the places we had come across. It was slightly annoying the land was mostly flat and we wouldn't have the high ground, but that was fixable with enough manpower. It wouldn't be a quick job, but we could eventually turn the land into a slope leading up to it. The thoughts caused me to be lost in my head, and all the others saw was me go completely speechless. Took until Austin's shaking that I snapped out of it. It felt like all the fatigue burnt away at seeing it, and a rush of energy flooded my system. A rush that I quickly turned into giving orders. Austin, find the nearest water source and get an initial survey of the left side of the cliff leading that way, I said, pointing in one direction. Hal, you take the other? A gesture to the other side to match. Someone get Braden up here and bring that architect with him. I want to know if the cliffside is safe or if it will break away. Jonathan, gather the few people with earth affinity and do the same. I want you to do your best to feel the earth. Help Braden decide if the cliff is safe. I said. Any with an earth law can strengthen it if there are any problems. Having the people with earth affinity survey the cliff was a long shot, but I wanted to make double sure anything unsafe would be caught now before we started making plans. Plans of our potential permanent stay. With what I could think of delegated out, I turned to the last member of our group who I hadn't given orders to. Abigail. I turned, looking at her. Start breaking camp and plan for an extended stay. Chapter 165, Real Work. A flurry of activity overtook the group after they realized we would be setting up for most likely the last time, and people had a pep in their step doing so. Tents were set up along with the preliminary defense line that was common practice by now, but it would soon see a more permanent upgrade. We wouldn't rush to build the final structures right away, but a more comfortable living condition first before we started on the heavy construction. It wouldn't make sense to be living out of tents while spending months building fortifications for our future city. More permanent structures now that we would later tear down was better for the long run than skipping ahead while people suffered in tents. It would let people move out of the tents and into something homier and better suited for the weather, which would be a not insignificant boost to morale. I swore, not 2 days after giving the order to make camp, log cabins were thrown up in record time, like all of the builders were just waiting for the order. Trees were abundant and building out of stone was unnecessary if we were going to eventually move. Even the combat-focused part of the group helped with hauling and chopping down trees for the builders to use like it was their job. It was lightning quick to go from ranges of tents packed closely together for warmth to organized blocks of one-story cabins lining the area near us. Their pace was a sight to behold and showed how excited they were to finally be off the road. Another structure we prioritized to have built was a few barns the horses could stay in. Leatherworkers and crafters had already come up with winter jackets for them that they wore during our stops, but now we could put them into an enclosed structure away from the wind. Sarah said they seemed happy with the barns, and that was good enough for me. I checked on Remy occasionally, but that wasn't high on my list of things to do. While others leaped into action building, we had to examine the surrounding area in greater detail. If this was to be the place we built, we needed to know its ins and outs and where different resources were. There was ample access to wood and logs from trees, but good quality stone was something we still needed to find. Veins of metal were another we hoped to locate as well. Water was readily available, we only had to melt it down from ice, but food was our main concern. We were still stocked full with meat from the wolves, but we weren't sure it would last the entire winter without rationing it. We had stockpiled and planned ahead, but without precise knowledge of how the winter would go and when it would end, we were left estimating. We would continue to hunt, but those results weren't guaranteed. While it was likely, we couldn't rely on it to happen in any great quantities. Abigail planned for no increase in food and would only adjust when more was found rather than expecting to find some. For the scouting of resources, I had Jonathan and the other earth affinity of our group looking for stone while the few with metal did the same. Metal wasn't a common affinity, but we did have a small number who had it. Vincent ended up buying a lot at the end of the tutorial, and we got more from the dungeons we stopped at along the way, but we would eventually run out. Finding more now would ease that worry for later. Stone was first, though, and was what I had more people working on. Before any construction could break ground, we had to decide if placing the pylon now was a good idea, and the discussion was rather conflicting. Gaining access will give us a better idea of what we can do with it. We know from Tracy that appointing a merchant opens up some possibilities, and those could help during construction. Surprisingly, it was Hal who spoke for placing the pylon. Any other change of function would be better to know now rather than waiting. I doubt the wave it spawns will be difficult. Knowing that Tracy overcame it, we should be able to do the same, Austin added offhandedly. We have no idea if we can move it once it's placed. Doing it now seems premature, and we should wait until we have more planned out. Abigail believed placing it now was too soon. Even though she would probably be the one to benefit greatest from doing so, she spoke against it. We've been at this for months. Placing it now is fine and will give people hope. We can probably move it afterward to where we will build for real. Sam countered. The words "probably move it" were something I didn't want to find out were false firsthand. During the entire trip, the pylon had sat on one of the carts along for the ride. It created a buzz whenever we came across new people because they could feel it from afar. I knew some came looking to take it but changed course once finding out how large our group was. Any who were opportunistic enough to do so decided against trying for ours. Most with the ability to go against our group would have already received a pylon already and would have no need to do so. Without extensive exploration of the area, we were still unsure where exactly we were going to start permanent construction. In the few days we had been here, no one had been able to do anything besides a cursory look up and down both sides. Austin and Hal were beginning to do more detailed scouting, and I meant to do the same, but the fact we hadn't made placing down permanent roots impossible. We will wait, I said. We've gone without for months. A week or two more won't hurt. Rushing would help no one, and I didn't feel like it was necessary. Waiting until we got a better picture of the area was better in my opinion. No one continued the bickering after that, and it was taken as final. That moves on to our next topic, the dungeons. Should exploring them be a higher priority than what we're currently doing, or should we wait until people gain free time? Abigail read off the list we had created. The list had things we had to decide on, and placing the pylon was only the first of many. Most of the initial planning was me coming up with the things that needed to happen first. Making better living conditions was the obvious first choice, but with that finished, we needed to decide what our priorities should be. We should at least see what the 2 dungeons drop so we can plan around it. Running them to find that out won't take long. Austin chimed first. Most likely so he could explore something fun while the rest of us worked. We were close enough to the next marker on the map that where we stopped was close enough to the 2 dungeons in the area. They were on the other side of the cliff, but that wasn't too difficult to overcome and get around. The planning around dungeons was rather tricky because it impacted a few different things. The most important of which was our treasury, or lack thereof. I turned to Abigail since she would know best. How long can we afford to not pay our workforce? During the tutorial, we didn't really pay each other inside the family. If work needed doing, someone did it. During our trip here, services were exchanged with the expectation of getting something in return. Blacksmiths and leatherworkers didn't demand payment from people the same as cooks didn't for their food. It mostly evened out for everyone to gain something from their work, but that wouldn't last. Where people were once happy just to make things to get experience, they would want monetary compensation sooner or later. I think the reason it hadn't happened already was because we, my family, brought in the most resources to begin with. It would hardly make sense for them to demand payment when we were giving them the resources they used to work. While that was true during the trip, that wouldn't continue to be so. Payment would eventually be an issue, and Abigail knew public opinion and sentiment best from organizing all of it. That depends, she started. If their work continues to be directly relevant to them, for a while yet. But if you have them doing something that won't affect them, then soon. That's not really an answer. How direct is directly relevant? Austin asked. Well, what they're doing now, for example. They are working to directly improve their living conditions. Houses and structures that increase quality of life directly. The same would be true for general buildings as well, like smithies or tanneries. If it was for their use, I should add, she said. But if you ask them to build you a personal smithy for your use only, that's not very relevant now, is it? The explanation made sense, but I needed more specifics if we were to plan for anything. What projects fall under that, in your opinion? I asked. Since houses are already built, general storehouses or shops would be fine along with basic perimeter defenses. Anything beyond that would cause an issue. As soon as shelter and safety are established, payment will be necessary. She answered. How long can we afford to pay them with what we have now? I asked next. That was the main timeline for when the dungeons would be opened. There was enough work to do that people were needed here, rather than spending time in the dungeon, and I didn't want to open them until that changed. The thing that would change that was if we ran out of money. The taxes from what the dungeon gave out would be our only income for a while until we got the pylon up and running and we figured out trade. With what we have, a few weeks. The value of a coin is still high and we can stretch that pretty far. Trades could be considered instead of payment in coins directly. A new sword or weapon would go a long way for some, or a different service we can provide in exchange for their work. There are various ways to extend the money and also ways to recoup some of it as well. Most of the material is ours, so we can charge them to use it along with a general tax now that we are planning to become permanent. Abigail explained. I was wary of establishing a general tax so soon after setting down, but it may become necessary in the long run. Ideally, I would wait until people settled in and became at least a little comfortable before starting that. I could run the dungeons a few times for coins if it became necessary, but there were other avenues to fall back on. We had seen different things during our travels, and Tracy was kind enough to explain some of how she started out. Taking advice from her about how to rule a city wasn't the best, but it was good to get ideas from. Ways to gain essence and levels were few, and delving dungeons was one of the main ones. Fighting in the wilds was still an option, but dungeons were the easier of the two. Dungeons could only be run so many times in a day, and regulating those spots could be used as a form of payment. To the scouts and people we put on watch, we could pay them with a slot in the dungeon instead of coins themselves. Others would also be available to pay that way, but payment in coin was going to be necessary for the crafting focused of the group. Coins or materials would be the only things they needed rather than dungeon slots. While this wasn't the most riveting discussion, it was the most necessary. I could just force people to work, but there were a variety of reasons that was a bad idea. Setting aside the fact it was just plain wrong, it wouldn't lead to a very prosperous city. Resentment would build, and it would eventually come crashing down. Using force and people's fear of me wasn't a sustainable way to run a city, aside from the fact it was something I was unwilling to do. Framing it in a way people worked for free because I protected them and provided them safety was essentially the same thing with extra steps. It was only their fear of leaving and braving the wilderness instead of their fear of me, which felt like the same thing in my eyes. Plus, it felt like something Tracy would do, and that made it wrong in and of itself. Having this discussion now would ward off any of the problems that would come up from not doing so. If we got ahead of things, we could run things smoother and without running into more problems. The main thing was I wished for people to want to live here. Our population now was more out of necessity, and that was fine, but for it to grow, people would need to want to come here. I was trying to set that into motion now. Our council had a many-hour discussion ahead of it, and that was only scratching the surface. After dungeons, we had scouting plans to come up with. Personnel lists we needed to finalize, along with a few other things. A census was the first thing that needed to be done to see how many and of what professions we had. If we were missing any, we would need to come up with how to fix that. While our traveling days were over, the real work was only just beginning. Chapter 166. It's time. My shovel bit into the ground, and I heaved the separated earth up and out of the way. Even as cold as it was, sweat ran down my face briefly before freezing to my skin. Pulling the shovel back down, I slammed it into the hardened ground once again to repeat the action. The line of dirt leading away from me was longer than it had been yesterday, and that was all that mattered. No matter how little progress I made in a day, it was being made. Starting construction at the beginning of winter wasn't the smartest idea, but it was all we had. It beat sitting around and waiting for the ground to thaw, as that was months away. The ground ate up tools almost quicker than we could forge them. Shovels needed a hardening treatment so good they matched some of the swords we were putting out in durability. I even had to put runes on them in some cases. A day's worth of work would usually see them bent and disfigured before they were dropped off in a pile for the blacksmiths to work on. Me included. We didn't have enough blacksmiths to shrug the work off onto someone else, and even when my days were filled with hard labor, It continued in the forge after the sun went down. The reforging and adjustment of shovels was almost instinctual by now and wasn't something I thought about often, but it was the reason my spirit ached from overuse. My strength, particularly, was hard on the tools. Any amount of design altering or adjustments to the materials wasn't enough to keep it from deforming, and I was not about to use precious metals for making a shovel of all things. Without the ability to make it stronger, I had to resort to other means, which was constantly reinforcing it with my spirit. While cumbersome and exhausting, it got the job done. One thing I did notice with the constant use of my spirit was I had more of it than before. I was used to running out during long fights during the tutorial, but now that I was using it all the time, I noticed differences. I had done something to increase how much of the energy I had. It felt more robust, and I could use it for longer compared to before. How this happened exactly was a mystery, but I chumped it up to constant use. Another heave, and yet more earth was moved. An effort that sometimes felt futile when I looked out over all the stakes laid out. The crunch of snow alerted me to someone approaching, but it wasn't a surprise. I knew I would be interrupted soon and expected someone to come get me. "Chris, we're ready," Abigail said. Sigh. "All right." Putting the shovel down, I climbed out of the slight depression in the ground and looked over my progress. Weeks of effort only for a line a couple 100 feet. It was frustrating, but there was nothing I could do about it. Not many could work in this weather, and those that could were tied up with other things. More important things. Grabbing my furs off the ice rack I had made for them, I tidied myself up while walking back to the camp. It felt like some of the dirt was permanent by this point, but I cleaned up the best I could. Without the constant exertion, the cold was a little much, even for me. It had only gotten worse as the days went on, and some of the lower-level people wouldn't even leave their homes for anything less than a quick trip. Firewood was in steep demand and was constantly being split for people's use. The initial scouting of the area was done weeks ago, and the cliff was thoroughly surveyed up and down both sides. Any place that wasn't structurally sound had Jonathan run over it with his affinity and law to fortify the earth. The architect we had didn't have the earth affinity, but he was able to tell Jonathan how to fix certain areas and keep them from crumbling. Undercuts on the cliff face were the main problem, where any amount of weight pressing on the edge would break off. Other structural challenges appeared, but they were able to fix all of them. A second look would go around once everyone was stronger, but for now they were fine. With the scouting finished, the site of our future city was found. The cliff extended hundreds of yards from one end to the other, and multiple sites had spots good enough to build on, but only one was the best. Or at least only one felt right. While the cliff was mostly uniformly straight, curves and abnormalities still existed. And it was in one of those abnormalities we found it. A 100-yard section of the cliff jutted out of the side and extended out past the rest, almost forming a mini peninsula if it were surrounded by water. While it wasn't big enough to build a whole city in, it was big enough for the castle. The city itself and its outer walls would have to extend the full 180 degrees, arcing from cliff face to cliff face, but the inner walls and keep would only have one direction to defend from. As soon as I saw it, I knew it was the place. While still assailable by land, it was only possible from one direction, and defending it was something I was confident in. One of the major weaknesses during the tutorial was my inability to be in more places than one, and this would change that. I would be able to stand in one spot and defend the entirety of the wall. Only one gate would lead to the castle, and I would be able to bar it from anyone who tried to attack. They would have to get past me if they wanted into the keep. After locating and having the architect stake out our plot of land, I began digging the foundation for it. The blueprint for what we would build wasn't complete yet, but the footprint it would take up was fixed. There was only so much space in the outcropping, which made how large it could be constrained. Not that the castle was going to be small, it didn't even take up the entire space we had, but it made how many different orientations we could build it few. Preparing the ground was slow going, but my dreams would come true eventually. I would force them if I had to. Our walk back was nearing its end, and I had to put those thoughts aside. Our weekly meeting was about to happen, and I needed to focus on that right now. It at least gave my body and spirit a break from digging. While the meetings were a slog to get through with everything that was taking place, I needed to be aware of what everyone was doing. Entering the lodge we set aside for our family use marked us as the last to arrive, and that didn't surprise me. They probably only came to get me once everyone else was already there. Austin and Hal were both sitting bundled up next to the fire, and if they got any closer, they would be in the flames themselves. They constantly complained about being cold and the fact they were always out in it. Scouting didn't give them a lot of time indoors. Austin was wrapped in so many layers I could hardly make out where the blob ended and he began. Hal's attire was less drastic, but the layers he had on were hard to miss. The others in the room were more moderately dressed, at least compared to those two, and Vinny was downright scandalous compared to Austin, only wearing an underlayer and heavy coat compared to the ball of fur. The heat radiating off him was cheating in my eyes, but it helped him keep warm. His forge was probably the warmest area for miles around, and it was certainly the only building without a thick covering of snow. The rest wore something between the two extremes and sat at the table waiting for the meeting to begin. With the last of us arriving, we were ready to start. Abigail and I took our place at the table and the conversation began. "Where are we on the construction effort?" I began. "Last we left off, everything was finishing up, but I wanted to make sure nothing new popped up." Everyone turned to Abigail. "We had to add another storehouse for all the food, but otherwise, all of the construction is completed. The builders will soon join you working on the city foundation. Our initial estimates were wildly incorrect on how much food would be available to us, and the additional storehouse painted that well. Basing our expectations on before manna arrived caused us some major readjustments after experiencing it for real. Winters before would be the time for everything to slow down. Animals would hibernate and predators would struggle for food. That was not the case anymore. Animals were abundant even with the harsh weather. Snow hares and ice foxes ran around without a care for the cold, and even more joined them. They were conditioned to the cold, and manna only made it easier for them to survive. Not only survive but thrive. The entire ecosystem had changed, and our expectations had to be thrown out with it. Even certain plants were still growing and could sustain themselves off of the cold energies. Not in large quantities or in great abundance, but it went to show how much was different. I thought it was a bit early to work on, but Abigail had people with either the gardener or farmer profession working out how to grow crops in the cold. None of the seeds we had would work to grow in the winter and would have to wait for spring, but she had them trying to either modify them or use the seeds of what was already growing. That wouldn't bear fruit anytime soon and was more of a long-term goal, but she was already pushing for it. Seeing things grow up here made her certain it was possible. Another reason for the additional storehouse was the food kept for longer. One positive about it always being below freezing was food didn't spoil as fast. We didn't even need to build anything to keep an area cold. The weather alone was enough for that. With our current stores, there would be no eating horses, no matter how many times Austin tried to convince Sarah we would. Much to the girls' dismay. The second half of what Abigail said was also good news. We called it the city, but it was mostly the castle. The city would come second after we had the castle built. I had been breaking ground on that by myself while everyone did other things, but I would finally be getting some help. While beneficial, that brought us back to one of the first things we talked about. "So it's time?" I asked. Abigail's nod confirmed it, and I wouldn't be able to put it off any longer. Placing the pylon was talked about at every meeting, and ever since the site of our future city had been found, it only got harder to fend off. I wanted everything to be perfect before we placed the pylon, but that was unrealistic. I knew that wasn't going to happen, but I at least wanted some kind of construction finished first. It seemed like that wouldn't be the case. Everyone then gave their report on the areas they kept track of, but nothing important came up. Things were progressing as planned and nothing unexpected arose. Even Vincent didn't have anything new. He wasn't usually in our council meetings, but he was added to our group not long ago. He was in charge of most of the crafting and his input was needed. Our stock of tools and materials was mostly handled by him, and having him here was easier than asking him all the time. The meeting wrapped up in record time, and I couldn't help but feel that by design. All of them looked at me expectantly. "Fine, we will place it now." I sighed. By their faces, I knew they weren't going to let me delay its placement. "I'll grab the pylon and meet you over there." My original plan was to fight the wave personally so no one else had to deal with it, but I was persuaded against doing so. Allowing all who wanted to participate would create a sense of camaraderie that wasn't easily overlooked. Fighting for the creation of a city would create a sort of nationalism that I couldn't afford to go without. It would instill a pride in people that they helped found it. An us instead of a you, as Abigail described it. She said if I didn't let anyone join the waves and fought them all alone, people would always see it as my city instead of our city. Abigail wasn't the only one who tried to convince me, and I eventually caved. She also mentioned the bonus of fighting with me instead of watching me fight would improve people's opinions of me. The benefits of allowing everyone to fight outweighed doing it by myself, so I agreed. Even if I wanted to fight alone, those times were soon coming to an end. The location where we would place the pylon was far enough away I didn't think anything here would be attacked, but a few would stay behind just in case. Some of my family didn't wish to fight, and they would be able to look over things here. With all of that in mind, it was time. Gather all who would fight and warn the rest, I announced. Chapter 167. Name your outpost. Finding the pylon was easy. It would be harder to overlook it than it was to find it. Its beacon effect hadn't diminished or disappeared over our months of travel or construction. Even if Abigail tried to play hide and seek with it, which I swore she did with certain materials, by moving it around to different carts intermittently, I would have been able to find it. Felt odd to hold it in my hand. When we were first introduced to them and saw one at the start of our tutorial, it was already affixed to the ground. It was already placed, and we weren't given the option to move it, only claim it. The pylon I received at the end, the one I now held, wasn't affixed to anything. It was a midnight black rod that seemed to eat light and fit in my hand comfortably. It measured about 2 feet in length and a few inches in diameter, a far cry from the size I knew it was. I knew it would grow into the obelisk I knew from before once placed, but it was still odd to hold it in my hand. If people hadn't heard our warning yet, they certainly knew something was up now. The pylon was rarely, if ever, moved, and people would be able to feel it as I did so. It was no surprise that a crowd began to form as I walked with it. They all knew what we were doing by now. Around half our number, just over 100, stood geared ready to fight. More than I expected from the group, to be honest. Not everyone was so inclined to violence after being given a chance to settle down, yet 1 in 2 chose to fight. The fighters were geared and ready, wearing determined faces with only the barest hint of nerves. Not all knew what would happen, as only a few had tutorials that experienced them other than ours. They knew from stories, but this would be their first time facing a wave. If I didn't have so many bad memories associated with waves, their nervousness would be amusing. Without having to say anything, the group parted as I neared and fell in behind me as I passed. Conversation was light amongst the group, and only a few people had the courage to speak. We certainly chose the right day to do it, I thought. While snow covered the ground, none fell from the sky. Clouds covered the blue expanse, letting the occasional ray of sunlight fall though to the surface. The occasional snowstorms took a day off for us to place our pylon in decent weather. While it would have made me stronger, the others would have had to fight through the hindrance. Arriving at our construction site unveiled another additional boon. With all the work I had been doing to prepare the ground, it was already clear of any snow for us to fight on. It was easy enough to use ice manipulation to clear the frozen carpet of white, and it made it easier to visualize what I was doing. It was easy to confuse distances when everything was a monotone white. As we arrived, people turned to me expectantly for direction. None had experience in larger organized fights like this, and it would be a first for many of them. Even with my growing confidence in leading groups from our travels, it was still somewhat awkward to be in charge of so many. The largest battle I had been in was against the Mindbreaker, and that was only a fifth of the number I was now in charge of. Plus, I wasn't even the one leading most of the time. I was off on my own for most of the battle. Others usually led during the defense of the waves, and by the time I started doing it, the plan was already set. I didn't need to do much other than fight. Luckily, my foray into large-scale battles would be relatively simple. I knew what to expect. I knew what would spawn, and I only had to array the people to fight against it. Shields front. Rogues behind. The group shifted after my shout, and a group of people hefting shields stepped forward. Metal-on-metal clanks could be heard as either the full plate or half plate, depending on what they chose, clinked against each other. The 20 most heavily armored of our group settled into the front of the line. While sword and shield were the most common weapon arrangement, there was a healthy mix in the entire group. Short spear and shield was second most common, followed by axe or mace. After the shields were set, another group of 19 set up behind them. These were rogue-type classes that weren't best at frontline fighting. They were set behind the wall of shields to take care of anything that got through or to help out the front line if it was overwhelmed. None wore the heavy plate the front line favored, instead donning hardened leathers and thick furs. This kind of structuralized fighting wasn't where their class excelled, but they were good enough to kill things quickly behind cover. It was when they were outnumbered and surrounded that problems arose. This group sported shorter weapons and usually used both hands as well, dual daggers or short swords. Some chose not to and kept their offhand free, but those who chose to do so were few. Warriors split and hold the flanks. While the rogues were in charge of helping the shields hold the line, the warriors without shields were in charge of holding the sides. The majority of warriors used a shield, but 15 chose to go without, not including myself. Two-handed weapons like spears or greatswords were most common in this group, but there were other things as well, such as two-handed battle axes and one with a quarterstaff. Jonathan's twin shields weren't the only uncommon choice of weapons. Archers back. The same shifting occurred, but this time it was swift and without the associated clanking. Bowmen were the least populous archetype besides healer in our group, while also having the longest range. The faster arrangement was due to the fewer people who had to move. Including Hal, only 13 others held the class. I called them archers instead of rangers because most weren't the base class anymore and had evolved out of it and into a wider variety. Archer encompassed them all, and that was why I used the general term instead of ranger. Plus, everyone knew what an archer was, and it made it easier when giving orders. Mages form up based on affinity. The last group besides the healers finished sorting themselves out. 27 people in our group chose the arcane route and were firmly in second behind the warriors in number. We knew from experience having two opposite affinities next to each other hindered them, so we devised splitting them up. While it wasn't the end of the world if it happened, it was easy enough to fix. Gabriel and Rachel stood at opposite ends of the line as they were direct opposites. Other matchups had to be separated as well, such as the lone lightning mage and the few metal mages. While they could be used in tandem to great effect, we weren't a coherent enough group to stop friendly fire from happening. The same was true of lightning and water. If any water was connected back to the mage and lightning struck it, the mage was in for a bad time. Or if water splashed on some of the warriors and then lightning struck, it was just easier to separate them for now until they were used to working together. It wasn't like we trained for this yet. We certainly would after this, but I had assumed the first wave would be me by my lonesome. The last group was the healers at only around 10. While the assortment of classes told a picture, it was far from the full one. This was only half of our group and only those who wanted to fight. While having 10 healers for a group of 100 seemed few, there were more back at the camp who chose not to fight. My grandmother and Sam included. Abigail and Ashley chose to join us in the field. I had them interspaced throughout the lines, attempting to go for equal coverage. Our formation was far from the best, and there were no doubt some who had specific environments that would make them better, but for the first wave this was enough. It would give everyone a taste of the waves while being a simple enough battle that things weren't chaotic. Specific classes or fighting styles that weren't suited for this kind of combat would need to be incorporated with proper planning that we just didn't have yet. With our formation set, it was time to place the pylon. Standing at the center of where our future castle would be, I brought the pylon out in front of me. After accepting the message to place it, it began to change in my hand. It jumped from my grasp and started extending out, growing in both directions as it settled into the ground where I placed it. Placement of civilization pylon accepted, initiating claiming of land. After it became the pylon I used to know, another notification chimed not a moment after the shifting ended. Defend your claim. Ah, the dreaded notification is back. Well, what used to be the dreaded notification? It didn't hold that existential creeping fear that it once did. Everyone must have gotten the same notification because reactions sounded out from the group. Those who knew the drill didn't show any outward expression, but everyone that was new did. While I waited a beat for Hal to convey what we were up against, I moved through the crowd to take my place at the front. The wave could only come from one direction, and I would take my customary place as the vanguard. Positioned in the dead center, I only stood a step or two ahead of the line of shields instead of way out in front. I would hardly be fighting with the group if I stood out ahead and fought alone. Austin chose not to join me, and that was fine. He was off to the side with the rest of the shieldless warriors holding the flank. Goblins! Level 30 or so with highs at 50, Hal shouted. While a bit tougher than anticipated, it was around what we planned for. Tracy had mentioned what her wave was like, and this was a few levels above that. Either she was lying, which was unlikely considering the relationship she wished to foster, or the waves weren't constant. Just another joy to plan for. We didn't have the high ground, which made it take a moment to pick the wave out from the trees, but I saw the shifting bodies eventually. The tree line was cut back during my work, but it had yet to be cleared enough for easy visibility. They were similar to the goblins we had fought before, but their levels changed them. The goblins from before were much lower level and weren't nearly as coordinated as the ones I was seeing now. They didn't march in ranks or hold a formation, but they were clearly denoted by the different evolutions as they had varying sizes and weaponry. A collection of metal weaponry along with some bows were among them. A few at the back wore feathered caps carrying staves, which I marked as shamans. Their numbers were few compared to what I was used to and only outnumbered us around 2 to 1. After looking over what we were up against, I signaled the start. Archers, fire at will. Arrows whistled overhead and more flew through the air than our number would indicate. Hal and Carrie chose to join us, and both of them had splitting shot trained well. Or, in Carrie's case, her evolved arrow rain. Those two could put out multiple arrows from one shot, and it seemed they weren't alone in having the skill. Not knowing the range of how far they could shoot, I left it up to them to dictate when to fire. Same with the mages. Everyone had a different range their skills could go, and I didn't know everyone well enough to get a good picture in my head to order volleys. The mages didn't need any prompting, and once the goblins closed in, their magical fire joined the arrows in the sky. Rachel's fireballs were easy to pick out due to their size, but other attacks held a strength to them as well. I witnessed a patch of the snow rise up and completely encase a goblin running over it, and I knew of only one who could be responsible for that. It was an odd thing to experience and watch take place. It was so far away from how we started that it felt entirely different. Large clusters of arrows and devastating bolts of magic that I witnessed now made the first wave of the tutorial feel like child's play. Where we once only had 3 rangers and 7 mages, more than 4 times that number were now releasing their attacks together. The goblins died in droves, but the distance from the tree line was short enough that half would make it to our line before they fell. While I felt the fight would be a bit of a letdown, this battle wasn't for me. I would usually be throwing javelins of ice or firing of ice arrow at this time, but I refrained from doing so. This was a rare chance to get experience leading, and I wanted to make the most of it. Bows continued to loose and swirls of mana flew through the air, but the goblins were closing in nonetheless. I readied my hammer as they neared. Brace shields! While the line wasn't enough to interlock in any fashion, they lowered themselves and got ready to receive the goblins' charge with skills flaring up. Before the lines collided, I could see various objects flying out from behind me, striking the leading goblins down. Throwing knives and other bladed objects from the rogues behind us, or throwing axes and javelins from those who had them. It cut down the first few, but there wasn't enough to blunt the charge by much. As the lines crashed, I brought down my hammer on its first victim. Mighty blow was unnecessary, and my bare strength was more than enough to end its life. I left my more excessive skills alone and stuck to swinging my hammer for the most part. I didn't even use frost armor for the battle. The line of shields handled the charge well, with only a few sliding back from the mass. As the goblins' momentum stalled, shields dulled and the glow transferred to weapons as skills activated, and our front line had its time to shine. Arrows from the goblins tried to rain down on us, but they were swatted out of the air by the wind. I was unsure who was responsible, but I believed it was my mother. Similar to the arrows, any magic the goblin shamans tried to wield failed spectacularly. either washing over the mana shields of those who had them or imploded with other skills before they landed. Without having to deal with any projectiles, the front line was able to have their sole attention on what was in front of them. We outleveled the goblins by a decent degree, and while they landed a few blows, it wasn't enough to bring anyone down for long. The few unlucky enough to catch a bad hit had a healer on them before the blood could start flowing. I fought with one eye on the wave and one keeping track of what was happening around me. It didn't take much attention to wield my hammer, and even the sliver I was giving it was more than enough. My attention elsewhere made sure no one died. If any looked to be unaware of a threat or in a losing situation, a law-infused spike of ice freed them up quickly. Letting people fight like we planned was risky, and I tried to make sure that none paid the ultimate price, or at least attempted to. I wouldn't be able to do this forever, nor was I perfect, but I did my best to keep casualties from happening. A few took nasty wounds while I had my attention elsewhere, but no one looked to be in any fatal danger. As the goblins' number dwindled, my need to interfere dwindled with it. As the numbers turned against them, people began working together. A shield in front to hold attention while a warrior or rogue finished them off. Arrows were deadly accurate, and they could even fire through our lines. That was a bit risky in my opinion, but if they trusted themselves to make the shot, I wouldn't say anything. Until they slipped up, but I didn't see any of that happen. While it wasn't a good fight personally, it was a good showing of how far we had come. We could fight in ranks decently, and we weren't total amateurs at it, which was a good enough foundation to start on. I did see a few standouts that I would try to convince to join my guards, but everyone who chose to fight did well. It made me feel good about the future. It was little more than 15 minutes after the wave began that the last goblin fell. As it did, the kill notifications came in, and I saw people look over what they had. Some should have leveled, even if I did not. It was hard to focus on what I had killed when one other notification stuck out from the rest. You have successfully defended your claim. Name your outpost. Chapter 168, City of Frost. Luckily, we knew that names could be changed. Tracy had a funny story about finding out that tidbit of information. Nick had apparently named their outpost something stupid, and Tracy had to convince him to change it. She never ended up telling us what he originally picked, but the name they came up with afterwards was Stormfront, as a play for the man's affinity. I didn't meet the guy, but from what Tracy told us, he loved his affinity and refused to let the outpost be named something that didn't include it. I wasn't as vain as that. I didn't much care for what the city was called. It didn't have to have ice or Arctic in the name for my sake, but since the area we were in was currently a winter wonderland, it seemed fitting. If one were to look back and connect the fact that we named our city after the area we were in, and then add that we were only here because of my affinity, then in some sense the city was named after my affinity, but that was semantics by that point. Still, I elected to wait on naming the outpost and dismissed the notification to the side for later. I didn't have any names prepped, but I probably should have. My focus was more on getting here and starting construction rather than what name I would call it. We would talk about it and throw around ideas before I finalized anything. Still, people needed to be seen to for various non-lethal wounds, and cleanup needed to take place. As much fun as exploring the new pylon would be, that could wait until later. Good job, everybody. Let's start on the cleanup, I announced. Everyone seemed pleased with the outcome, and I was happy as well. It wasn't standing alone against an army proud, but it was something to be proud of at least. With some training and coordination, I could put together a decent force to be reckoned with. After the cleanup, all of my family who cared to weigh in stood surrounding the pylon, coming up with names. Some were good, while some were laughably bad. We should name it Icefall. The snow clinging to the cliff face kind of looks like a frozen waterfall, Gabriel said. Austin snorted before rebutting. No, that's stupid. Winter's End is way better. No, it's not. That means the end of winter, not. The bickering continued, and it was slightly amusing to see everyone's thoughts. Most threw out some variation of ice, snow, frost, or winter with either a suffix or prefix attached. I couldn't fault them for it, because all of my ideas were in the same line of thought. Other than what Austin and my brother were bickering about, Icefall and Winter's End, a few others were proposed, yet none stood out to me, but I did have the inkling of an idea. Most of my classes so far had followed a theme, and I wanted to lean into that. I didn't care much for Norse mythology before the world ended, but it seemed to love me from the classes I was offered. Champion of Niflheim, Hammer of the Jotnar, Frost Giants, all of it had ties to the stories of old. It made me question how much of it was real if we were close to the mark with our legends. That line of thought spiraled further into how we would possibly know of it, but I didn't wish to go down that route. I had a name to think about, and those thoughts could be left for later. Keeping in line with the Norse theme, one that stuck out from the rest intrigued me. It kept to the similar convention of frost and then something, but I liked it nonetheless. Frostheim. I hadn't realized I said my idea aloud until everyone turned to look at me. Frostheim seemed like a good choice for the area we were in. A land of ice and snow with deadly winters. It's somewhat translated to land of frost, but I liked it. I couldn't very well name it Niflheim, as that was already a thing and it could possibly be a real place. Plus, Frostheim sounded cool, and as much as I liked to think it didn't matter, it did. As people chewed on my idea, there were no immediate disagreements. They continued to hem and haw, but no one could think of anything better. To push everyone over the edge, I added, "We can always change it later if someone thinks of something better." I would be heavily against it as I liked Frostheim, but it was still an option. Nods of agreement went around, and we had finalized the name of our city, and I entered it into the notification. Frostheim. After doing so, the usual menu for the pylon came up. It didn't hold as many options as I remembered, but to see the familiar screen again was a relief. It also had the option to appoint an outpost chieftain. It was a step down from the town mayor Abigail was before, but it opened her profession back up to gaining experience. Her profession wouldn't devolve down to her current position, but her evolutions would be hindered if we didn't raise the pylon's rank before she reached level 100. Reaching that for her profession would take quite a while, and we had time to upgrade our pylon without rushing. As soon as the notification came through on her end, I could see her eyes flickering back and forth, reading all of the menu screens, no doubt. She didn't wave her arms around anymore like I still did, as she had much more experience with the menus. It was just easier to point and touch, and I never bothered to change that. I spent little time in the menus anyway. They were different than the status screen and the notifications that popped up usually, requiring more than just a cursory look. Those could be called up or dismissed with a thought, or minimized with practice, but the pylon screens were different. They had a plethora of different tabs and options to click on and explore, which made the simple commands of open and close not available. You could learn to do it all manually, as Abigail demonstrated, but I never allotted the time to do so before. It seemed like a waste before. I was content to learn eventually, through practice of using the menus more often. On my end, I could see the different adjustments she was making, and I let her have free rein. There was an option to restrict what she had access to, but there was no need to do so. That was more for people who didn't trust their advisors completely. Abigail was family. I trusted her with my life, let alone city management. Some of the options needed an input now, but others could be put off. Tax rate was the biggest one, and we had finalized that before we placed the pylon, like we should have done for the name. While the dungeon tax rate would stay at 1 in 5, 20%, the city's tax rate would be half that. 1 in 10 or 10%. Sam brought up a good point that people chose to go into dungeons while simply living wasn't. Someone who worked as a blacksmith selling wares to make a living was different than people who ventured into dungeons. In that, we decided to lower the tax rate for those people to make sure they were able to make a living. This was all subject to change, though. We weren't sure how the economy would turn or if certain things would affect it, but we were all right with setting it to 10% for now and seeing how that worked. Setting the tax rate through the civilization pylon was a touch different than paying taxes from before. The system, being all-powerful and whatnot, had what I called a wallet feature. Similar to how the points worked in the tutorial, there was a section for coins listed on everyone's status screen. Mine had remained empty for the entire tutorial and still was. While I had physical coins in my possession, there were only certain ways to transfer them into this wallet section. Gabriel came up with ideas for why, and one was actually pretty funny to me. He claimed that being able to instantly transfer wealth from the physical to our status screens would make thieves and banks obsolete, while also requiring the system to conjure physical money at every being's whim. Whatever the case was, one of the ways to do so was through a merchant. Not all could do it, but if they had the skills, they could take the physical coin and deposit it, so to say. They would, of course, charge a fee for doing so, but it was possible. Merchants weren't the only to hold that power, and other professions could as well as certain buildings tied to a pylon. Banks and marketplaces could be built inside cities that had a special link to pylons that could facilitate the same action. While all of that was way in the future for our fledgling city, it helped explain how the tax worked. Or more specifically, how it didn't. Someone could, with a coin in hand, walk up and buy something with it while never paying the enforced tax. The system only enforced it on transactions that occurred with the transfer of coins through the status screen. While I was 100% confident the system could have enforced both, it was likely it chose not to. With how much the system liked to demand a price to do anything, watching every transaction in every city in the entire universe was too much of an expenditure, even if it had the ability to. There were other ways to avoid this tax besides paying with actual coins. Exchanges of services couldn't be tracked along with bartering. I wasn't too concerned with tax evasion right now as it was impossible to track. Once we had the infrastructure set up, that would change, but taking people in good faith would work for now. People would cheat it, no doubt, but that was fine for now. It would begin being an issue when our population started to rise. The few coins or so we lost now weren't that big of a deal. Other than setting the tax, Abigail appointed our first advisor slot. Well, other than the city leader spot. Tracy tried to explain the way the advisor slots worked, but it was hard to grasp without seeing the screens in front of me. I filled one slot and was considered the city owner, having full control over the pylon and anything among its menus. Next in line was the person who managed the city. I could have taken the position if I wanted it and been both the owner and the manager, but I didn't want to. It didn't require me to change my profession, but managing the city without the associated profession was 100 times harder. Plus, it didn't make sense to do so when Abigail was already good at it and had the profession. So while I was highest on the totem pole, Abigail was second. Similar to how Nick and Tracy ran things. Next came the various advisor slots you could appoint. Things like a treasury advisor or security advisor. The names could be changed or positions split up, but their function was clear. Every position did something different, but mostly, it delegated some of the tasks of running the city to different people. It allowed them access to certain menus that they would need without opening up all of them. Head merchant was one of them that Abigail filled first. Jonathan was here with us around the pylon and accepted the notification swiftly. He hadn't thrown out many ideas for names, but he knew he would be needed for this part. While I wasn't going to restrict the advisor slots to only my family, I wanted to get our feet under us before we started branching out. The fact he was the highest level merchant in our caravan was only a nice bonus. After his appointment, an entirely new screen came up, and I couldn't help but smile at it. The shop was back. Baby? Well, there were some changes, but it was similar enough. Opening that tab of the menu led to a staunchly bare list compared to what we were used to, but it was still exciting to see anything available for purchase. Pelts from certain animals were common along with mundane materials. Logs of wood or hunks of stone that weren't high in grade. We weren't advanced enough to buy things from other planets, and the list only held what other pylons were selling, and not even all of them at that. It only populated with listings from pylons that weren't too far away. At the bare minimum, we had at least one pylon in range. I wasn't sure what the exact range was, as that was dictated by how strong the merchant appointed was, but I was glad to see anything listed. We hadn't seen a single pylon after leaving what used to be Chicago, and I wasn't sure we were close to any. We did travel in mostly a straight line and hadn't deviated to where any past cities used to be, but my mind chose to ignore that bit. Increasing that range could be done in a few ways, but that wasn't that important right now. I doubted anyone was selling anything useful, but that would change eventually. Abigail changed a few other little things before I closed the screen, but we didn't have any more appointments to make. What took priority now was construction. Just thinking of digging again made my spirit ache. Chapter 169. Time. Time was a funny thing. Could, at certain points, feel like it moved at a snail's pace, like how the 3 months of the tutorial had felt like 3 years. Or, at other times, fly by faster than you thought possible. With the bare necessities taken care of and our pylon placed, There wasn't much we needed to do with great urgency. We were where we were supposed to be, our travel was over. What came now was the hard part. The construction effort wasn't a speedy process by any means, and I wanted to make sure it was done right. No corners would be cut and everything would be done to the utmost perfection. One thing I refused to do was conjure the walls from the ground like I had seen Tracy doing. Buildings made that way weren't as strong as ones made of natural stone, and I didn't come all the way north with dreams of a castle to create something not as strong as it could be. Using that method also wouldn't take runes or formations as well, making them significantly weaker to attack. Also something I refused to let happen. Instead, I had all Earth affinities who were willing to do so out searching for a good quarry site. It wasn't hard to find decent stone, but I wanted the best. As we grew in strength and received better skills or better techniques, our current methods would be obsolete, but that wasn't an excuse to not build something to the best of your ability now. It would be years before people reached D rank, and while it would be a hassle to redo everything, I was willing to do it. An attack wouldn't come with a warning that would give us time to change it. Either due to luck or general availability, a massive vein of granite was found which was perfect for our tasks. It was the hardest stone in the world and would make for perfect fortifications. It also took strengthening enchantments well, which made future formations that much better. Hauling it only made the process take longer, but I was fine with that. To pay our workers, regular runs into the dungeon had to be made. We didn't restrict entry into them and anyone could delve if they wanted to, but our income from taxing what came out wasn't enough to pay everyone, especially for the backbreaking labor I was asking of them. Crafters and builders made special wagons for stone transport along with cranes and winches, but it was still a Herculean task to do it for multiple hours a day. Many received an increase of strength weekly through the exertion, or daily in some cases of weaker people. Regular delves into the dungeons to make some coin was necessary to keep everything going, which fell to my family. Everything I pulled out of the dungeon went to paying our workforce and most of what everyone else did as well. It reminded me of fighting the fallen pylons to farm points, as the principle was the same. I needed money or points in the previous instance, and I got it through killing beasts. Having both dungeons, there was a godsend in that respect and gave us enough to keep everything going. As the days went on, it was easy to fall into a routine. Every morning I would wake up, eat a meat-filled breakfast, and then gear up for my daily dungeon runs. While beginning every day with a decent amount of bloodshed wasn't the best, I liked to think of it as training. It wasn't a wave I was forced to endure or a beast coming for my head. It was my prerogative to go into the dungeon, and that put it all in a different light. The fight wasn't forced upon me, but it was me searching it out. It took most of the tension out of it and made it easier to face every day when I woke up. If I had to face a wave every morning like in the tutorial, I wasn't sure how long I would make it. It reminded me of something I said to Gabriel: how I looked at it mattered. Looking at my morning dungeon runs as a chore would make me dread them over time and see them as nothing more than a way to make income. With that in mind, I chose to look at them like training sessions. Not many in camp could be my sparring partner, and fighting the usual crowd got stale after a while. I knew their fighting styles, and it wasn't enough to keep me sharp. Austin was flighty and quick, keeping distance with his speed while chipping at you with his spear. Fighting him made me favor my cold and the environment to get an advantage. While his spear had a longer reach than my hammer, he still had to get close enough to use it. To counter that, he would use his longer-range skills so he wouldn't have to brave the cold to approach me. My ability to tank damage was too much for him to get through, and the whole song and dance would repeat. Jonathan was the embodiment of a turtle, and calling on his bloodline only made it worse. Using his bloodline, law, and spirit anchor, he could tank my hammer using my full strength and avalanche built up. I could overpower him if I went all out and his defense would crumble, but his ability to stop my hammer cold was impressive, to say the least. Rachel was my least favorite to fight. She and Hal fought similarly enough, but she was infinitely worse than Hal. While both kept their distance and fired off skills at me, Hal's were easy enough to block. My manipulation of the wind wasn't a match for his, but it blunted some of the damage, and what was left was easy enough to let my armor handle. His damage was mostly physical, as the arrow carried most of the energy, and my ice dealt with it well. Rachel, on the other hand, turned every battle into a contest of mana control, and it was a battle I always lost. She started out with a better mana control than me and only got better at it. I trained the skill, but not to the extent she did. Gabriel was the only one I knew that could give her a run for her money. While I could lean on my better law, it only evened the playing field somewhat. After that, it came to who had more mana, and that was not me. It only got worse after she got her bloodline. Where before I could attempt to challenge her, it was impossible now. The draconic bloodline she managed to get did more than increase the potency of her fire, but also increased her already good mana control. Fighting her was still a challenge, but it didn't really feel like a fight to me. It was more of an intense training session. That was fine, but training in the dungeons added that edge that sparring lacked. It had stakes that fighting the others didn't and kept me on my toes. The 8th floor had some monsters that could challenge me and was by no means a walk in the park. It was also a steady stream of essence every day and gave me a steady way to gain levels. My progression had fallen off during our journey, and now was the time for it to pick up again. Currently, I sat at level 66. Austin had pulled ahead to somewhere in the 70s, and even a few others had caught up. My legendary class took more essence per level, and both Body of a Barbarian and Frozen Fortitude took a bit extra per level. The debt holding me back was gone, but they still took a little extra essence per level to give me the extra stat points. I was used to getting up early during the tutorial, and I carried that with me until now. The dungeons took a while to repopulate with beasts to fight, and I made sure I was first in line every day. While I could have barred entry until I went through, getting up a little earlier to make sure I was first wasn't that difficult and was the better thing to do. There were occasions when by the time I got done with one of the dungeons, the other already had people lining up, but they were nice enough to let me go first. Running both dungeons took a few hours every morning, but it was a routine I would try to stick to. Not many chose to run through both, and even fewer delved every day, but I needed to make sure I kept progressing. The world wouldn't stop just because I had, and the months getting here were enough of a break already. I didn't feel the crushing weight to keep leveling up like in the tutorial, but I knew strength would be needed for the times to come. Humanity was just beginning to get its feet under them. Troubled times would come once the immediate threat to everyone's lives was dealt with. When the seas settled and the barest hints of civilization were re-established, the fighting would start. And when the time came for someone to march against me and mine, I would be ready, both in personal strength and the strength of what I had built. Only the barest hint could be seen right now, but time would change that. Every day we spent toiling over it now would save lives in the future. I was sure of it. Once the foundation was readied, my job would shift to something other than construction. The builders, architects, and engineers could handle that side of things. I was in charge of the wards. I hadn't spent all those points and hauled the precious materials all the way here to make a lackluster formation. Gabriel and I were already coming up with different solutions to the problems we would face. With superhuman strength and abilities, climbing the cliff to attack from that angle was a very real possibility. It would be extremely difficult, getting attacked the entire way up, but the cliff wasn't the impossibility it was before skills were a thing. Another thing we had to account for was simply jumping over the wall. We were planning to make the wall quite high already, but with ever-increasing physical strength, the possibility was there no matter how high we built it. In the later ranks, flying would be an issue as well, but that headache would be left for when that became possible. The other two issues were what we focused on solving first. While there were many ways to fix those problems, not all were practical or feasible. Grinding the entire cliff face down to a smooth finish to make it impossible to grip was certainly an option, but it wasn't a permanent one. Anyone with an earth affinity would be able to morph the smooth stone into handholds easily and bypass all the hard work we put into it. What made our job the hardest was the sheer plethora of skills people could possibly have. There was simply no way to come up with a solution that would work for everything. The good thing was we had the time to think about it. We didn't have to come up with the answer right this second, and we would be able to brainstorm for a while longer. While we allowed other people to give their input for the construction side, I only spoke to Gabriel about the enchantments we would put down. The physical layout of the building would be easy enough to steal through espionage, but what the formations did was a defense secret I wasn't willing to divulge. Most weren't able to read runes in the first place, but I planned to keep them secret for as long as possible and had plans to make that so. Building the formation while construction took place would allow me to carve them inside the walls. Doing so would make it nearly impossible for people to find out what they did without getting extremely close and spending a lot of time searching through the stone. It was in this period of time that flew by faster than I thought possible. The winter's peak came to the apex and began to wane with spring close on the horizon at a moment's notice. It was like I blinked and our weekly meetings went from discussing food stores over the winter to our plans for the farmers and where we would put the fields. Our progress as a smaller group made me wonder how the pylons around the world were doing. The cities with over 100 times our number had to be built by now, right? Chapter 170 Year's End. As the spring rains came to wash the snow away, it completed the first year since the world was altered. While Chris and his fledgling city were slowly making progress on rebuilding, the rest of the world did the same. Some had a head start, planting their pylon and building exactly where they were returned, while others had to seek out new places to carve out for themselves. The foothills of Virginia, being one such area, had turned into a perilous place for even the strongest on the planet, let alone the average human, causing any return there to journey far away before they felt comfortable setting down roots. In places similar, where the mana was thick and the monsters strong, people left in droves, seeking safety and shelter wherever they could find it. A mass exodus away from certain areas happened all over the globe, and in some, it still happened. Where man once stood at the top all over the globe, some areas inverted that scale, and it was undecided if it would ever be flipped back. Some were able to painstakingly, and with great losses, fight against that hierarchy, reestablishing order and plant the seeds of civilization, but just as many stayed and died, failing to accomplish what they had hoped. Where some fought walking horrors of grotesque monstrosity seeking to eat them, others had to fight for the resources just to survive. Water and food weren't freely available, and stocking up took more than running to the store like it used to. Rivers, streams, and watering holes were precious resources that many things needed for survival. While humans were among the many who needed them, they were far from the only ones. The fight for territory between man and beast was rough for the first few months, but it had settled as the year went on. The animals that man used to be wary of long ago became an even bigger threat after mana arrived, but they were far from the only threats people now faced. Mother Nature had made sure its dominance was not forgotten. Supercharged storms filled with mana were the smallest on humanity's list of worries. The laws of the universe weren't there for human use only. They were laws for a reason, and that was made known to all who witnessed them. The very phenomena the laws were birthed from took the biggest death toll in certain areas. Hurricanes and tornadoes were powered by the very wind laws some sought to obtain. Monsoons and tsunamis rife with water laws wreaked havoc along the coasts, while earthquakes rippling with earth law leveled everything for miles in some cases. Wildfires consumed swaths of nature and burned with fire laws so hot that the ground melted in some areas. Not to be outdone, nature laws blossomed and plants grew like weeds, consuming land in their own way. The landscape wasn't the only thing that the system changed while it had its way with our planet. Creatures thought long extinct roamed the earth again, and some would even claim beasts from myths and legends did as well. Only a scarce few had the chance to witness such creatures, and most who had were dead, eaten by the very things they thought were only fantasy. Over 10,000 civilization pylons were given out as the tutorial ended, but less than half remained standing by the year's end. The good news, if you could call it that, was the rate at which they fell dropped with every passing day. Another positive outlook was while the total number of pylons went down, the ones that remained got stronger. Soon, the falling numbers would stop, but it would never be stagnant again. The world was too wide a place for that to happen, and the system had only made it wider. Rise or fall, stagnation wasn't an option anymore. Chris' point of view, the time spent doing things right had done us well. Thick granite blocks carved and chiseled into shape stood tall and proud, dominating the landscape. Pride overflowed inside of me as I looked them over. Months of work had gone into the process, and we were nearly ready to cap it off. The blood, sweat, and tears of over 100 people went into this project, and I couldn't be happier about it. The beginnings of my castle stood at the edge of the cliff, and it would weather any storm thrown at it. It looked slightly odd without any walls or gates to accompany it, but they would come in time. But even without them, I was confident in what stood before me. I could feel it in my spirit that it would not fall. Spirit anchors were still new ground for most, and not many knew how it all worked, but I poured everything I had into the structure, my spirit included. My anchor felt fitting to saturate what would be my home. Every day for months, I drained what little spiritual energy I had and packed it into the stone used to construct my home. I wasn't sure if everyone could feel it, but when I looked at what we had built, it felt like the world would stop spinning before it stopped standing. Maybe that was just me being biased, since it was my anchor that I could feel. As my eyes approached the cliff, the ground turned into a rising slope of manicured stone 10 feet wide that rose at a gentle angle leading upward, meeting up with the rest of the building. After following that ramp to its end, a massive double door made of heavily reinforced wood barred the way in. Metal curved and looped throughout the wood, interwoven throughout both doors, and even the wooden bits received a special treatment. For this part, I had Jonathan pour his spirit into it instead of mine. His was more fitting for the door, and I felt it would do better than mine would. The wood was also strengthened with every skill we had at our disposal. Builders with any they had, along with every nature mage inside our city. I had paid handsomely for every person with a wood law to bathe the door in their power. The law empowering it would fade with time, but the treatment increased its strength permanently, if only by a lesser degree. The lingering law had worked through the grains and righted what was wrong before it faded, altering the wood into a stronger form forever. After that, runes of durability could be seen depicted by the metal reinforcing it. Cleverly carved into the wood and inlaid with precious metal bought from the tutorial. Done by my own hand along with help from my brother, the door had taken US days of work and study. Studying what enchanting books we had available took longer than the work itself. Looking at it now let me see places that could be improved, but I stubbornly moved on from those. As the work continued, my runesmithing had gotten better, and so had Gabriel's enchanting. As we got better, it made me want to go back and fix all of the small mistakes we could now notice. It would be a perpetual problem, and one I would have to live with. The tiny imperfections didn't warrant redoing the entire door, as they would only make it marginally better. I would wait until a drastic improvement could be made, until I went ripping things apart. This entire city would be a never-ending construction project, but I would make it the best I could, or I would die trying. I envisioned it as a living, growing piece of art. A not insignificant amount of my time would go into improving. One I was happy to sink hours of work and spirit into without any remorse. If the strength and spirit I poured into it would one day save my family, it would all be worth it. After forcing my eyes to move on from the door and what tiny imperfections I could see, they were only able to take in one side of all its glory. While the ramp and door were first to be taken in, the rest of the castle wasn't to be outdone. A small mountain of stone stood before me, reaching high into the sky, and I knew it was only one wall of 4. The wall was hundreds of feet wide and over 50 feet tall, with towers interspaced along its length. The 2 visible corners stood out above the rest, topped with guard towers thicker than the wall itself. They protruded out from the edge to give sight lines to any attacking the gate. Slits ran up its length, only a few inches wide starting from its base, and ran the entire height, and while the tower stood out atop the wall, it wasn't the only one. For others were interspaced along the top. Smaller and not as large as what manned the corners, they added to the imposing image facing me. 2 stood on either side of the gate, overseeing all who would enter, with 2 more at both midsections. The engineers and masons had outdone themselves, and I would have to do something nice for them. Originally, we had no masons to speak of when the project started. Only gaining our first after a few had chosen to evolve that way when given the option. Builders reaching that threshold who had gone that route were rewarded by me personally. After seeing me give out rewards to the lucky few, some had chosen to discard their current profession and start from scratch with the ones I needed. Our group had a wide range of professions, but not all we needed were represented. Miners were our biggest bottleneck, as not many wanted to mine stone all day. It took a heavy incentive from me to convince any to make the switch. Switching professions was hard on people in both body and spirit. The profession that was being discarded was essentially ripped away from the person. All it had given in terms of stat points and skills was scraped from the person to make room for the new one. It set people back by months' worth of work in some cases, and that said nothing of the pain it caused. While receiving stat points was a pleasant experience, feeling your body growing stronger, the opposite was not so fun. It took signed contracts guaranteeing work, dungeon access for their class, along with a decent amount of coin before any even considered it, and even then, not many chose to sign up for the process. Among the profession books we had kept and brought with us, Miner was not one of them. Mason was, thankfully, but most of the resource-gathering ones were forgotten. It was hard to know everything we would need when we didn't have all the information. Abigail blamed herself for not thinking ahead, but I blamed the shoddy information we were given. It wasn't like we were given a guide on everything we would need and every situation we would experience. We didn't even have a list of all the possible professions, let alone those that would benefit a city. During our tutorial, no one had felt the need to choose the lumberjack profession when we could just as easily cut down trees without it. I, as a blacksmith, had cut down my fair share. Little did we know the full benefit a resource-gathering profession could offer. Not only were they faster and more efficient at doing so, but their skills could increase the grade of materials they brought in. Where a regular person could only harvest the grade of wood available to them, sometimes even worsening it depending on the method of harvest, the dedicated profession could increase it. When I was trying to build the strongest possible fortifications, any increase in material grade was most welcome, even if I had to pay a premium to make it happen. Money did become an issue, though, as things progressed. I was not as flush with coin as I made it seem. I could easily clear all 8 floors of both dungeons, but that only netted me just over a silver a day. Roughly 50 copper per dungeon wasn't enough to keep everyone happy on our payroll. 100 copper, or a silver if you wished to convert it, paid for nearly 8 hours of the work we had done in a day. Not only did the construction workers need to be paid, but the people gathering and hauling the material as well, let alone the farmers after they started work when spring finally arrived. With how far north we were, the planting season came a little later than most, but we weren't so far up that it never came. While the winter seemed like it would never end on some days, the chill did eventually break for the warm southern air to come through, much to my annoyance. Anyway, while the castle stood alone for now, walls would soon join it and fill out what I had dreamed. Right now it was a very sturdy stone house with guard towers. A house I was fit to move into now that we were done. A house that I hoped to be my seat of power for years, no centuries to come. It was hard to change my thinking into longer time frames, but I was beginning to come to terms with how long I would live. End of chapter 170.